And and we're off. Hi everybody. It's 1 o'clock. It's Monday, so it must be time for our weekly half-hour exploration into the world of Pirkei Avot and other things that sort of waft out of it. Excuse me. Um, I've noticed that, especially by the way, the live feed that I've been doing on the Shul. Please excuse me. I'm trying to get this right. On the Shul live feed, has the lighting has been sort of odd, so I apologize for that. I did get a ring light, which came just the other day. I haven't quite figured out how to use it yet, and I hope that once I do get the hang of it, things that the quality will get better. Okay, so let's get down to work. A half hour is not a long time. Last week we started discussing Hillel. We talked about his biography, and we talked about the Mishnah, in which he talks about the necessity or the importance of being of the students of Aaron. I'm still trying to fix this, and we'll see in a minute that what he mentions there is very important for the next Mishnah. But first, let's read the next Mishnah. Huaya Omer. He also used to say one of his. Apparently, he was a person who had a lot of favorite sayings. Huaya Omer Nigid Shema Avad Shemei. A person whose a person becomes famous will lose his name. We'll see what that means. Or a person who extols or advances his name will lose his name, or his name will ipso facto become lost. Udala Masif Yosef. If you don't grow, you in fact will, according to the literal translation, you will die, but it really means you will contract. In other words, if you don't expand, you will end up retreating. Udala Yalif Ketila or Ketala Chayav. If you don't study, you really deserve to die. So pretty very, for a guy who's sort of like, for the guy who was hiding on the roof, this is sort of very bombastic and very dramatic. And finally, Udish Tamesh Betaka Chalaf. Um, and anyone who uses the crown will leave this world or will die. There's a lot. There's a lot to, what's the word you guys use? Unpack here, and I will try to get to it. It's going to take more than 1 week. I'm warning you in advance. But the first thing I want to point out to you is the fact that as opposed to all of the Mishnayot we've examined up until now, this is in Aramaic, and the Aramaic was the spoken language of the Jews in the entire Middle East area, in Egypt and in Eretz Israel and Syria and in Babylonia. And that by itself is an important thing to point out. That contrary to what goes on today, there really isn't any kind of hesitation about using the vernacular to teach Torah. On the contrary, the rabbis bent over backwards um, to um, to make sure that the Torah is accessible. That's the reason why there's an Aramaic translation to the Torah, which is printed almost with certainly every major traditional um, edition of the Torah. Of the three of them, actually, you've got the Targum Onkelos, or Targum Arami, the one that's attributed to Onkelos, and they used to, and the old Eretz Israeli and even Babylonian rite was that you should read it as part of the Torah reading. I mean, they used to get up there, and somebody would read, and the Hebrew were a few Hebrew verses or one verse, and then you'd read the Aramaic so people would understand. Those of you who lived outside of Israel, you can imagine what would happen if somebody said, "Well, I want to start reading the English in between verses." I mean, they'd start throwing things at you. There's a very, very different kind of take among Chazal. Now, one of the funny things that happens is that Aramaic sort of became sacred because Aramaic was the language in which people learned, in which Torah was taught. It became sort of a quasi-sacred language by itself, so that um, what happens is that there's a lot of objection to, and I understand the objection and I support some of the objections. There's a certain objection to the idea of translating the Talmud and other things into English but rather you should study it in Hebrew and Aramaic. But the truth of the matter is that Aramaic was the English of the ancient period. So exactly where the two we should draw the line educationally is a really serious issue. Interestingly, I should mention that people studied Aramaic, and Aramaic was part of people's education. Even those who didn't study Talmud extensively, way into the Middle Ages. For example, among Ashkenazim, this I can attest. Among Ashkenazim, we know that they were reciting the Targum as part of the Aramaic translation into the as part of the Torah reading way into the 12th, 13th century. The Talmud says that you should every day you should study, every week you should study Shnai Mikra Targum. In other words, every week you should go over the parsha, twice with in Hebrew and once with the Aramaic translation. And the idea being that people understood the Aramaic translation. And in fact, one of the things that people don't know, usually because we're so asleep that we don't pay attention, is that the recitation of the Aramaic Targum was a very big part of the drama, especially of the Torah reading, especially on Shavuos. It's the custom, the practice is to recite before the Ashkenazic practices, to study before the recitation of the Kriyas Torah on Kriyas Torah on Shavuos, which describes the giving of the Torah. The practice is to recite this long, involved, technical Aramaic poem called Akdamut. And there is a major discussion as to whether when you should say it, should say before they begin the Aliyah, afterwards. I don't want to go into that right now. But this poem was written in the 11th century. This is after Jews long had, no longer, Jews are living hundreds of years already in Europe. They're not living in areas which naturally speak Aramaic. But this was an Aramaic poem, which some people understood, to be a preface to the integration of the Aramaic translation into as part of the Kriyat Torah. Just, just one of those things. In fact, I think you could even see Aramaic as sort of like the Yiddish of study, way into the late Middle Ages. Which raises the question: so why shouldn't we read everything in English? Why shouldn't we read everything in French? I think partly because Aramaic and Hebrew at least are closer to each other, and therefore it's easier to get the original. Secondly, because the tradition has its own value, and because translation, by definition, is a dicey business. We have this expression, right? Tradikere tradukere. If you translate, you betray. You never quite have the suppleness. You never quite have the same depth of understanding or capacity of interpretation in translation as you do in the original. And since the original, say Talmud, was in Aramaic, so we keep it in Aramaic. But nevertheless, those who don't see value in studying in translation, it would, I think, by implication, leave people out of Torah study are actually wrong. And you see from Hillel made a point. We'll see. It's not the only time. Hillel made a point of making sure that a lot of the things that he said would be in Aramaic and would be preserved in Aramaic. So that's really worthwhile. If you're interested in a discussion on this issue, by the way, I will recommend again this wonderful commentary on Pirkei Avot by my friend and colleague Professor Zev Safrai. He actually put out putting out a full parish on the Mishnah, but the one about Avot is really very good. It's published by Lifshitz Teachers College and Machon Herzog. And today, and I don't get any percentages here. And I today received an email saying that they're having a sale, so you can order online. And I really very strongly recommend it. It's a wonderful commentary. All right, enough. Let's get to the Mishnah itself. Nigid Shema Avad Shemei. If your name becomes exalted, you've lost it. There are so many places that you can take this. It's really, really stunning. And it might be, and my first response was, now, we'll see in a minute that one way of looking at this Mishnah is to say you can see it as an integrated whole. And I think that's a worthwhile way of looking at it. But let's break it down into its component parts first, and then see how we can integrate all of it. Nigid Shema Avad Shemay. If your name becomes great, or if you enhance your name, or if you promote yourself, you're going to lose your name. Now, let's take a let's think about that for a minute. Personally, I can't not think about this in other outside of the contemporary obsession that's fostered by Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and what else did I miss something? Facebook. I mean, obviously Facebook. Um, the search for fame. Fame is a very fame which goes together in Jewish, morality and ethics with the search for honor and respect and deference and so on. Um, is a is a very dicey, very problematic thing, and we are obsessed with it. We are obsessed with it. We've become a lot of one. We've become absolutely totally obsessed with our own idea of fame and outside validation, as well as with the fame of others. And yet here comes Hillel and says, "Negid Shema." If you have a famous name, you're going to lose your name. So if you simply stated, and a lot of the commentaries say this, that if you become too famous, the more famous you become, the more prominent you become, the more exalted you see yourself and others see you, the more vulnerable you'll be. That if you really let it go to your head, people the higher you go, people are going to take a shot at you anyways. But the but that you can't help. But the truth of the matter is, what you can help is to not let it go, not let things go to your head such that it will be self-destructive. I'm reminded it just happened to have come up the other day on the night. Oh, let me think of this. The ninth of Tevet, which is a week ago, um, there was a tradition. There was a fast day, and 10th of Tevet, we all know that was actually turned out to be Christmas Day. But the day before is also a fast day, and nobody really know why it's a fast day. It's that by itself was a long discussion. I recommend there's a senior colleague of mine. His name is Professor Schneier Lyman, a wonderful, brilliant, and outrageously educated, knowledgeable person who knows everything. He has a site called the Lyman Library, Leiman, and there he has a long discussion about what he thinks the origins of this ninth of Tevet fast were rather. But in any case, one of the suggestions for the reason for this fast comes from the year 1066. In the year 1066, the wazir, the prime minister, if you want, senior minister of the king of Granada, was a man whose name was Yehosef Halevi. Yehosef Halevi was the son of his father was even more famous than he, a man named Shmuel Hanagid, who was a very fascinating individual. He was a poet, and he was a Rav, and he was a philosopher, and he was a politician, and he was a civil general, and he did all of these things while in the service of a Muslim king, which is by it, which on never mind the full panoply of the things that the man did. He was to do this when you're supposed to be a second class citizen, as Muslim law demands, was an amazing achievement. But he pulled it off, Shmuel and Agid. And the way he pulled it off apparently was the fact that he knew exactly to keep his place. In other words, he knew not to make himself too big. He knew to keep his head down. He knew not to be arrogant, to go about his business, and to simply do what he had to do without trying to earn fame and adulation. And this way, he didn't attract too much attention and didn't attract too much adulation and too much jealousy, and he managed to pull it off. His son Yehosef said, "I don't play this game. I'm a big shot," and he let it all go to his head. And as a result, he lost his head, literally. So that may be one way of looking at Negid Shema Avad Shemay, that you expose yourself to jealousy, and people will try to take you down. But but given that that's just a practical thing, and how you exactly pull that off is something of a mystery. But there's something deeper and more moral that's important here, and I think that's what Hillel is. One way of looking at Hillel's comment: Negid Shema Avad Shemay. If you organize your entire life looking for kavod, if you organize your entire life looking for validation and adulation by other people, um, that's going to open you up to all kinds of moral and ethical failings, which will not which will start with you and may very well have ramifications for a lot of other people. Um, we live in a society which is, for example, obsessed with the idea of external validation. I think it's kind of sad. I did a search. Okay, I did a search on Google, for example, on the question of looking for likes. I think is the way I put it, something like that, or the search for likes. I got. Are you ready? 4,450,000,000 links to discussions about how you can maximize your likes, how you can organize your likes, and no matter what it is. How many of us take a look to see whether it was something we put up on social media? Do people like? Now, are these people? As my wife likes to say this, do you know these people? Do you care about these people? But it becomes this thing, and if you don't get enough likes, then you get people get very upset, and so on and so forth. Nigid shema avad shemay could then under that sense mean that the more you're looking for self-aggrandizement, the less you're going to think of yourself, because you're going to make your own self predicated upon what other people say. Now, obviously, what other people say is important, but question on who. One of the problems with social media is that every person gets to say what they want, which is ostensibly fine, but we take it seriously, and not everybody has to be dealt with exactly the same way. Um, in addition, in addition, of Nigid Shema Avad Shemay, the more that you are exposed, the more you end up attracting detractors, because there are people who spend their time trying to bring other people down, and in social media they tend to do it in a very very nasty and miserable and unethical way. And that by itself raises another very serious moral and halachic issue. Um, One of the places, it's not something which a lot of people that I speak with whom I speak like to acknowledge, but we tradition Jews who are for whom Jewish tradition is important. Um, we live in a world in which we try not to be at dissonance with the two worlds in which we live. In other words, we try very hard not to, on the one hand, to remain loyal to Jewish tradition, and also at the same time to live in the modern, post-modern, whatever world the West has put us into. And we try to the best we can, because people can't live in constant conflict over everything. They try to bridge it, and sometimes there are values in the outside world that make sense to us, and we want to see that they don't conflict with Judaism. And a lot of that time, that kind of effort really does pay off. There are, however, places where the fundamental um, assumptions of contemporary society and contemporary culture are at total loggerheads, are at absolute odds with fundamental Torah values, neither of which are negotiable. In other words, neither side is willing to negotiate, because you're talking about what are called in German Grundnormen, basic norms that from which everything else derives. And the true and in one example of this kind of head-on and unbridgeable collision is that according to the acceptable norms of postmodern or contemporary culture and morals, if you want to call it that. Among those norms are the absolute total autonomy and freedom of the individual. The individual is at the center, literally, of everything. Therefore, there is no such thing as harming oneself. One has that right. I own my body. I can decide to do to my body whatever I want, as long as I don't hurt somebody else. Or the right, or as somebody once put it, the right of my fist ends at the end of your nose. but everything else in between is fair game. So I can, if I want to end my life, that's my right. I'm totally autonomous. My body belongs. First of all, my life belongs to me. It's my life. How many times have you heard? It's my life. Therefore, I will do with it as I wish. It is my body. I will decide which treatment to get or which treatment not to get. I will. I will take if I want to take if I want to take drugs. My right. Somebody could try to convince me maybe it's not a good idea, but I have that right. Number three, number three, obviously the abortion question goes right in here. Whose body is it? But let's not go there right this minute. And the third thing is it's me. It's my name. I can do whatever I want. You don't like it. It doesn't look good to you. Too bad. Kacha, chaval. I own my reputation. So according to contemporary mores, those three things are absolutely mine. I am totally autonomous when it comes to my life. Nobody can tell me what to do with it. I'm totally autonomous when it comes to my body. Nobody can tell me how to treat it, and I can take my reputation and do whatever I want. I want to do something dicey. I can do something dicey. But the Torah says the absolute opposite. Your life doesn't belong to you. God gave you your life. You were responsible as an. Yes, you're an individual. There's a tremendous amount for individual of time, room for to individual. What's the word? Initiative, and there's a tremendous amount of room for for actions. This freedom of choice is practically absolute. But at the end of the day, your life doesn't belong to you. That's the reason why the Torah is so dead set against euthanasia. It's so dead set against suicide. I mean, what is this? The Mishnah later on in Pirkei Avot will say? If you commit suicide, you endanger your soul. It's not, one of the translations I remember as a kid, I was reading a person who commits suicide, it deserves to die. I said, but what? It means no, you put your soul at risk because ultimately ownership of one's life, absolute ownership of one's life, is not ours, and therefore we put our souls at risk after death. That's one. We don't own our bodies. Every change in the human body that we do is subject to the Torah's restrictions. Now, 9 times out of 10, the two go together. But what happens when it comes? Is it mutter? Is it permissible to smoke? Okay. Is it permissible to take drugs? Is it permissible to put yourself to your health at risk at all? Never mind putting somebody else at risk. The answer is no. Now, is somebody going to arrest you? No, but here's the difference. The autonomy that the Torah recognizes and attributes to individuals is not absolute the same way that it is in general society, which is, if it's not 100% atheist at the moment, it certainly is aggressively so and increasingly so. It's one of the reasons, one of the you make for odd bedfellows, especially in the United States. In America, it's a little different, and Israel, it's a little different. But in the United States, where you have a situation where religions which are previously in competition with each other find themselves as sort of bedfellow, sort of strange bedfellows, because what they have in common is shared faith commitment. I recommend, by the way, a series of essays that's been written by Yuval Levin recently on this issue, and there was a recent Tikva podcast, I think it was, with Yuval Levin, specifically on this issue. Anyways, so we don't own our bodies, and we don't own our lives, and we don't own our reputations. That's the part that people. That's one of the things that people don't recognize, aren't aware of. There's a verse that there's a verse in the book of Numbers at the end of Bamidbar, when the 3.5 tribes come to 2.5 tribes come to Moses and say, we want to settle on the eastern part of the Jordan, and Moses says, okay. I mean, I'm not happy with it. Okay, but you have to you can leave your families in the what's now Jordan, and build cities and leave enough people to protect them, and then you have to come and fight with us and conquer the land with the rest of your brethren, and then you can go home. And if you do that, v'yitem nekiyim Hashem Israel. If you do that, you'll fulfill your obligations vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis the Jewish people. The rabbis interpret that verse to mean that when you do something, that what you do should not lead others to judge you poorly, should not lead others to besmirch you, should not lead others to suspect you of bad behavior. In other words, you're not allowed to put your own reputation at risk and to make yourself look bad. That's where the whole concept of marit ayin comes from. What is marit ayin? It looks bad. That people will look at you and you're doing something that will make 100% fine. But if you do it in such a way that other people will judge you poorly, then you don't have that right because your good name, first of all, is one of the few things you actually have. You can lose everything in the world, you can lose everything in life, all of your material possessions. But the two things which you will always have is your good name and also your relationship with God. You're not allowed to harm either of those. Um, and what's the reason? The reason there are a number of reasons. One reason is because your reputation affects not just you, but the way people talk about you and what you represent. The definition, for example, of Chilul Hashem, of desecrating God's name. We know the fancy, dramatic example. You sanctify God's name by dying for God and for Torah. All that's true. But for our purposes, since thank God we live in a time which is not one of in which martyrdom is a daily business, you're not allowed to do something which is going to make other Jews look bad. And every Jew represents all other Jews. I don't care how alienated that Jew is. People from the outside can say, "Oh, that's the Jew." So, for example, the rabbis say in one case that a rabbi is not allowed to buy on credit. Why? Because if he sees him go into the store, if somebody sees a person go into the store and take out a bunch of bundles and doesn't pay, and doesn't know that the rabbi has a credit, has a tab with the grocer, will say, "Oh, see, the rabbi's taking advantage of his position." Oila adam shekach lamad Torah. Woe to such a person who learns Torah. And there are all kinds of other examples. I don't have to go into. Well, you know what? I'll give you an example. B'didi hava uvda. When I was in college, I was driving home with a bunch of friends, and we stopped at. We were driving from New Hampshire, I think. Driving back to Boston, and we stopped for ice cream at Howard Johnson's. Now, Howard Johnson's ice cream. Does Howard Johnson still exist? I know Friendly's has closed, and that makes me very sad. Um, we stopped at Howard Johnson's to have ice cream. Howard Johnson's ice cream had a hechsher from the Father Rabbanim of Massachusetts, number one. And we ordered, so they brought it in, I don't know, it was in a cold ice cream cup that was never used for anything else. And we used cold things and sitting there. The waitress comes over and says to us, "Here's your ice cream, but you're not religious Jews, right?" So we said, "Why do you say that?" And the lady said, "Because I worked as a kid." She was a Shabbos guy. I worked as a young person for a religious family, and they would never ever even walk into a place like this. There was nothing we were doing that was really wrong. All right, maybe we should have had the ice cream with styrofoam cups and stuff, but there was nothing really we were doing wrong. And yet, because we acted that way, we actually besmirched ourselves and other religious Jews. That's not within our capacity. That's not within our right to do. Negid Shema, Avad Shemei. You're not supposed to be an Ibra Chacham, you would say. We're not allowed, if you let yourself get too big for your britches, you lose your name, and your name is one of the three things which is not yours to impugn or to impart. So those are two ways or three ways of looking at this statement of Hillel. There are, I counted here at least three more. I will hopefully get to them next time. As usual, you're welcome to follow, to comment in the comments here, to send me a comment on as a direct message on Facebook, or I'm going to post this on my YouTube channel and on Twitter, and we'll see you next week. Have a good week. Take care of yourself. If you're in Israel, get your inoculation and obey the rules.